Welcome to the third lecture in our series, The Second Temple Period in Rabbinic Eyes. Today's lecture is entitled, The Twice Told Tale of a Despot's Death, When I Die, Kill Those Elders. In ancient literature, we often encounter twice told tales, two different stories with the same essential plotline, though sometimes with marked differences between the tales. In this lecture, we will explore two chilling stories about a despot's death, one starring King Herod, which we will read in Josephus's writings, and the other starring the Hasmonean king, Alexander Yanai, and that story we will read in rabbinic literature. Okay? Scholars have long pondered the relationship between these two particular stories, questioning how did these two variations on the theme come about? Did one story draw upon the other, or did both stories perhaps rely on a third source? Okay? Recently, in their very impressive two-volume work comparing Josephus and rabbinic literature, Tal Ilan and Vered Noam, in a chapter they co-wrote, they argue that both tales are independent narratives. They were not dependent on one another, and by chance, as it were, they enlisted the same conventional and generic plot. Right? And that is the argument set forth in their chapter in this impressive work. Today, in contrast, I hope to enlist evidence previously not considered to show that we're actually dealing with an originally Herodian tale preserved by Josephus, which was subsequently transformed into the parallel Hasmonean tale preserved in rabbinic literature. So I will be arguing against the notion that this was some generic tale about an anonymous king which was attached twice independently, once to Herod and once to Yanai, and instead be arguing that we have an originally Herodian story which over time, at some point, was transformed by the rabbis into a story about Alexander Yanai. So now let us turn first to our story and a little background. We'll be starting with Josephus. In Josephus's account of Herod's tumultuous final years, in both his work, The Jewish War, from the 70s of the first century, as well as in his work, Jewish Antiquities, which is from the 80s, though he finished it in the 90s. Was rather large work, took him some years to write. So these tumultuous final years culminate in the story of Herod's horrific death, which we'll get to in a moment. Okay? Now, according to Josephus, a few years before dying, Herod executed his sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. He banished his brother Pheroras to his own tetrarchy. He dismissed his wife Doris from court a second time. He punished his wife Miriam II by striking her son from his will. And sometime later, he imprisoned his son Antipater. He executed some sages and their followers for destroying the golden eagle he had erected over a great gate in Jerusalem. He attempted suicide. And then he put his own son Antipater to death a mere 5 days before he died. So Herod's rash, cruel, and tyrannical behavior here in these final years, this behavior sets the backdrop for Josephus' story of his demise. Okay? So plagued with illness, Herod knew his death was imminent. So he hatched an evil plan to ensure that the Jews would rue the day he died. Okay? With only minor differences, this story appears both in the Jewish War and in Jewish Antiquities. We will read the account now as it appears in the Jewish War. And here we go. Herod started on his return journey and reached Jericho in a black mood, in which, hurling defiance, as it were, at death itself, he proceeded to devise an outrageous scheme. Having assembled the distinguished men from every village, from one end of Judea to the other, he ordered them to be locked into the hippodrome, Okay? So he is now imprisoning these Jewish officials, Jewish notables, distinguished Jewish men. Perhaps these were the men who already summoned in the previous eagle incident, which we didn't read, although I mentioned before. But now he's imprisoning these distinguished Jews from Judea. He then summoned his sister Salome, or Shalom, and her husband Alexas, and said, I know that the Jews will celebrate my death by a festival, yet I can obtain a vicarious mourning and a magnificent funeral if you consent to follow my instructions. So we hear here Herod's concern. The Jews will celebrate his death as a festival because they hate him. But he is going to figure out a way to turn his death into a sad day. You know these men here in custody? The moment I expire, have them surrounded by the soldiers and massacred. So shall all Judea and every household weep for me, whether they will or no. So Herod commands here his sister, Shalom, and his brother-in-law, Alexas, to have his soldiers massacre the incarcerated officials on the very day of his death, so that now he could attain a magnificent funeral, as the Jews, they would be mourning their officials, their distinguished notables, so now they will be mourning on the day he died as well. And that way he can attain for himself his magnificent funeral, the mourning on the day he died. Now Herod survived the execution of his son but 5 days, and now he passes away. So before the army had learned of his decease, so let's see what happens. Shalom left the palace with her husband and released the prisoners whom Herod had ordered to be put to death, telling them that the king had changed his mind and now dismissed them all to their homes. So Shalom and her husband, Alexas, they do not follow Herod's commands, and instead they release the Jews, keeping the king's death a secret meanwhile. Not until after their departure did she and her husband announce the news to the soldiers, summoning them and the rest of the people to a public assembly in the amphitheater at Jericho. So we see here they are refusing to honor the command. They do not follow the command, and now only they let it known that Herod died after, of course, everyone has been released. And then we hear here Ptolemy, to whom the king had entrusted his signet ring, came forward and pronounced a benediction on the deceased king, delivered an exhortation to the people, and read a letter which Herod had left for the troops, in which he earnestly appealed to them to be loyal to his successor. Now we have some passages here in Josephus which talk about the succession process after Herod's death. After this letter, he opened and read the codicils. Under these, Philip inherited Trachonitis and the neighboring district. Antipas, as we have already mentioned, was appointed tetrarch, and Archelaus king. The last name received the charge from Herod to carry his ring to Caesar with the documents relating to the administration of the realm under seal, because he had vested in Caesar the control of all his dispositions and the ratification of the will. The only point I want to take out from this last section is we see in Josephus' story of the succession process after Herod's death, there's this signet ring which is playing a role here, and it plays a certain role in the succession so that officially things can be orderly. Okay. And this is our story as it appears here in Josephus. So let's just sum up the story. Fearing that the Jews would celebrate his death, Herod commanded his sister and brother-in-law to put to death, to execute incarcerated Jewish notables on the very day he died. And in that way, the Jews would mourn his death as well. These trusted family members, the confidants who were in charge, did not follow his orders, and instead they released the Jews. Okay? Now this story is the only story of its kind in all of Josephus' writings. No other evil king crafted such an evil plot, and certainly not this particular evil plot. When Josephus relates to the death of another Jewish king, another hated Jewish king, Alexander Yanai, who had a serious fight, one could say, with the Pharisees, Josephus tells us that Yanai adopted a placating attitude towards his Pharisaic enemies on his deathbed, figuring that they would grant him a splendid funeral and a lot of honor if his wife permitted them to treat his corpse as they pleased, which is what she takes her husband's advice, and in the end he is respected upon his death. So no story, this story appears nowhere else in Josephus. This is a story we only hear about Herod. Now, we're going to find a similar story, as I mentioned, in rabbinic literature, and that story is going to appear in branch P, which stands for the manuscript from Parma, in the Scholyon to Megillat Ta'anit. And I just have to say a few words about this Scholyon so we'll understand the next sources we'll be looking at. Vered Noam, in her wonderful work on Megillat Ta'anit, showed wonderfully that there are two traditions to the Scholyon, the commentary, the rather late commentary to Megillat Ta'anit. One we call branch O for Oxford and one branch P for Parma. And they are essentially two different commentaries. Sometimes they're rather similar and their materials are quite similar. Sometimes they're rather different in their commentary of the days cited in Megillat Ta'anit. So that's just some information we need as background now, because we're going to be looking at branch O, branch Oxford, and branch P, branch Parma of the Scholyon to Megillat Ta'anit. Okay, first we're going to start with the day cited in Megillat Ta'anit as the festival which was instituted on the day that Herod died, right? And if we saw he had a concern that the day he died might become a festival, sure enough, that's what happens. So we start here, Scholyon to Megillat Ta'anit for the 7th of Kislev. So this is now a day when it was prohibited to fast because the day was considered a festival in Second Temple times, or late Second Temple times here. It's on the month of Kislev's 7th day, the day that Herod died, because Herod hated Israel and the sages. Since Herod was a hated king, because he indeed made the sages and Israel his enemies, so the day he died was considered a festival and fasting was prohibited. So that was the Scholyon to Megillat Ta'anit for the 7th of Kislev in branch P. Now let's look at branch O. Okay. On the 7th of Kislev, it's a holiday. Since Herod, the murderer of the sages, died on that day, for it is joyful before God when the wicked disappear from the world, as it is said, when the wicked perish, there is joy. And as it is said, indeed, the hand of the Lord struck them to root them out. Okay? So here we have both traditions of branch O and branch P. Branch O here is a little more detailed than branch P, but they tell us the 7th of Kislev was a festival on which fasting was prohibited. Why? Because that was the day the evil Herod died. Okay, and now we're going to move to a different date, the date of the 2nd of Shvat, and the 2nd of Shvat is the day preserved in the Scholyon. Says that's the day that the hated Hasmonean king, Alexander Yanai, that's the day that he died. So let's see. First we'll start with branch O. On the 2nd of Shvat is a holiday, since on that day King Yanai died, for it is joyful before God when the wicked perish. Okay? So, short tradition, just like we saw also a short tradition for Herod in one of the branches. So here's a short tradition. This was the day Yanai died, and it was a festival for the Jews. Okay? So far, we haven't seen our parallel story yet. And that comes in, as we mentioned, only in branch P of the Scholyon to Megillat Ta'anit for the 2nd of Shvat. And now let's see how the story appears. On the 2nd of Shvat is a holiday on which it is forbidden to eulogize. Okay? All right. The Scholyon interprets, that was the line from Megillat Ta'anit, and here's the interpretation. Since regarding the first date, really the 7th of Kislev, it is not written in Megillat Ta'anit on which it is forbidden to eulogize, so the date, 7th of Kislev, the day on which Herod died, it doesn't say in the text it is forbidden to eulogize. And regarding this date, the 2nd of Shvat, it is written on which it is forbidden to eulogize. Why are they, the two holidays, different from one another? Why on one day is only fasting prohibited, and why on the other day is fasting and eulogizing prohibited? For on the first, Herod died, and on this one, the 2nd of Shvat, Yanai died. Implication being here that when fasting and eulogizing are prohibited, that means we have more evil king. Right? The evil king here is so bad, not only was fasting prohibited, like in Herod's case, where fasting was prohibited, because it was a festival, but this festival is even happier. We're even more excited since Yanai died, and that's why both fasting and eulogizing were prohibited. So now, the Schalion will bring a story to illustrate how evil Yanai was, that he was even more evil than Herod. So here's the story. They said, when King Yanai became ill, he sent and arrested 70 elders of the elders of Israel, incarcerated them in the prison, and ordered the warden, when I die, kill those elders. For while Israel will be happy about me, that is my death, they will mourn their sages. They said, he had a good wife. Shlomtzion the queen was her name. And when he died, she removed his signet ring from his hand, sent it to the warden, and said to him, your master is healed, release the elders. He released them, and they went to their homes. Only then were they told that King Yanai had died. The day on which King Yanai died, they made it a holiday. I hope it's clear here that this story in the Schalion about Yanai is essentially the same story Josephus told us about Herod. Okay? Here too we have the dying king fearing that the Jews will not mourn his death. So he imprisons distinguished Jews. He orders a confidant to have them put to death on the day of his death. But after his death, a female family member thwarts his plans and frees the imprisoned Jews. Okay. Needless to say, there are a handful of differences between these accounts beyond the question of the king's identity. And here are a number of them. Unlike Josephus, who does not specify the number of imprisoned officials, right? The Schalion enlists here the classical biblical number of 70 elders. Okay? In Josephus, the Jews are imprisoned in the Jericho hippodrome. In the Schalion, they are jailed in a generic prison. Right? In Josephus, Herod charges his sister and brother-in-law with the heinous order, but in the Schalion, he orders the warden, the generic warden of this generic prison. Right? In Josephus, Herod's sister is Shalom, right? And in rabbinic literature, Yanai's wife mentioned here is Shlomtzion. Okay? They're two different but highly similar names. And in Josephus, Ptolemy, right, he brings the king's signet ring, and we saw how the ring plays a role in facilitating the process of the succession after Herod's death. In the Schalion, Shlomtzion uses the king's ring to save Jewish lives, much like we could see her predecessors, and even heroine, a female predecessor, in the story of Megillat Esther. And we can just see in this quote, the king slipped off his ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordechai. And Esther put Mordechai in charge of Haman's property. Esther and Mordechai will make use of the signet ring in the process in which they saved the Jewish people in that story. So here we see not only a difference, but presumably also the biblical inspiration for these differences. So despite these differences, and despite the apparent biblical impressions left on the rabbinic parallel, the 70 elders, the signet ring, we'll see one more in the future, a couple of minutes. The group of minor difference here, this group does not, it doesn't confuse us. It doesn't obscure the fact that we have here a core shared plot line. Okay? And these are, as we said, a twice told tale. So now that we've reviewed the two stories, we can finally ask, well, what's the relationship between them? Was one dependent on the other, or were both modeled on some third source? Okay. There are 5 good reasons up front to conclude that Josephus's earlier version, or something quite like his Herodian story, served as the raw literary material for the rabbi's later account in Schalion. And some of these arguments may sound familiar because we've heard similar arguments in some of our in the earlier lectures. Okay. Number one, Josephus's account appears already in the 1st century CE. Right? We have it in Josephus's writing, so we know the story about Herod is documented to the 1st century. The rabbinic account is not documented for hundreds of years, sometimes in the late Aramaic period when the Scholion is edited. Of course, late sources can always preserve very early materials. That's always a possibility, but everything being equal, that is not our default assumption. Our default assumption is that early materials preserve an earlier stage in a literary trajectory, and later sources preserve a later stage in the literary trajectory. And in order to make a case that later sources have an earlier account, one has to do a lot of work to convince us. Our default presumption is that the later sources preserve a later version of the story. So that's number one, chronology, that Josephus's account is documented much earlier than the rabbinic account. Two, the rabbinic story only appears in branch P of the Scholion and not in branch O. Now that would seem to indicate that this story of Yanai, the rabbinic story of Yanai, is not an original and stable element in the rabbinic tradition. Had it been part of the early Scholion, which predated the splitting of the two versions, we would have seen something of the story in both of them. But this just seems to also delay the story, that it seems that the story is quite late, as it only appears in branch P. Okay. Three, the nature of difference between the parallels is exactly what we have come to expect from rabbinic stories, since the rabbis freely recast and rewrote the raw literary materials which they received in the stories they retold. For example, the rabbis drawing inspiration from biblical conventions and biblical paradigms is a common feature, and we find several traces in our story. The transformations of Josephus's distinguished men into 70 elders, inspired by the saving role of the king's signet ring in Esther, a book which, as we also saw, influenced other rabbinic stories, such as the meeting of Alexander the Great and Shimon HaTzadik. So the rabbis recast the ring mentioned in Josephus, but now it has nothing to do with the succession. Rather, it's been formed in the image of the biblical paradigm, of the Esther paradigm, and now plays a role in the saving of the Jewish imprisoned elders. We'll mention parenthetically here another biblical figure entrusted with a king's signet ring was Joseph, right? In the famous story in Breshit. And in that story, we have Joseph also functioning with a prison and a warden. And perhaps in lieu of the hippodrome, the Jericho hippodrome, perhaps our appearance of a generic prison and just sort of a regular warden in our story, perhaps these are also inspired by the biblical paradigm of the story of Yosef from Breshit. Okay, so this argument was saying that the type of differences here we see in the rabbinic story are actually what we would expect to find in the rabbinic account of this sort, where we even have an earlier version. These are the type of changes the rabbis would make. Number four, the transition from Herod to Yanai is in keeping with a broader trend in rabbinic literature, where stories about evil kings from Second Temple times, like Herod or Yochanan Horkanus, these stories are moved, they're transferred in rabbinic literature to Yanai. So this is in keeping with that broader trend. We also have there's another rabbinic tradition about Yanai's attempt to execute the elders. He tries to do similar types of evil activity elsewhere in rabbinic literature. And we have here also the transition between two women of a similar name, from Shalom to Shlomtzion, which is a transition that's very easy to imagine. And Shlomtzion is a famous figure in rabbinic literature as Yanai's wife, and she was also known for protecting a sage, that is her brother, from Yanai. So it makes sense that she would have replaced here Shalom in Josephus' account, and that she is in the same role as saving the rabbinic sages. Okay? Number 5. In line with the king's concern in Josephus that the Jews would celebrate his death with a festival, right? This Chol Yom we see actually says the Jews did that. This concern is not only mentioned, but it actually happens. The Jews actually make a festival on the death of actually both of these kings, right? Both Herod, we saw, and Yanai, they make a festival on the day of their death. And this confirmation of the king's concern is actually a type of addition you would expect to find in a later work which extends and updates an earlier tradition, right? So I tried to offer here now 5 reasons why it would seem most natural to conclude that Josephus preserved an earlier version of the story, and the rabbis have a later version in which an originally Herodian story was transformed into a story about Yanai. However, despite the arguments I've just laid out, as I mentioned, recently Noam and Ilan have argued otherwise, and their argument is that both stories actually enlisted a generic and conventional plot. Let's just take a look. The first quote here: "This strengthens the conclusion that here too we have before us a tradition from the late Second Temple period, which was decorated with motifs that were widespread at the time." Here they're pointing out the story in both versions, it is argued, is a late Second Temple story. So even the rabbinic version, although it only appears much later, was actually already composed in late Second Temple times. And then they go on, the story is not linked to the temple, to the Jewish halacha, or to the Jewish holidays. It looks more like a universal story which was fit to be attached to any evil king. Okay. In truth, Ilan and Noam offer a number of arguments in favor of their conclusion, which unfortunately I don't have time to go through all their arguments, but the crux of their position, the crux of their argument, is that there's nothing Jewish about this tradition. And since it is not a distinctly Jewish tradition, it seems to be a conventional, a generic plot about an evil king, and it could have been assigned to any evil king. And it happens to be that it actually was adopted twice in Jewish tradition. Josephus adopted it once and attached the story to Herod, and the rabbis adopted it a second time independently and attached it to Yanai. Okay. However, as far as I know, this generic plot doesn't appear elsewhere. And if this rather intricate tale were a conventional and universal plot, I think we would expect it to find it somewhere else in ancient literature, but so far as we know, we don't have any other examples of this specific plot. But moreover, what I'd like to do now is explore further 2 essential components of our shared plot line. Okay? Number 1 is the evil king's awful intentions. Okay? So this focuses on his intentions and what he wants to do. The evil king in our story is worried that his death would be celebrated by the masses, right? So he intended to manipulate the people's sentiments. And how is he going to do that? He'll arrange a national tragedy on the day of his demise, thereby turning the happy day for the people into one of mourning. So that's the first element of our story, is the evil king's awful intentions. Second element in our story, right, is the evil king's foiled plot. Like, how does he implement his intentions? So he hatches this evil plot where he commands a trusted associate or associates, right, to put to death innocent notables on the day of his death. But a family member or female family member in the end foils his plot. Okay? I'll just say parenthetically before we move on, this seems to me to be quite a complicated plot, perhaps too complicated for a generic and universal motif or plot that someone could just adapt, but be that as it may. But what I'd like to do now is expand our purview to look elsewhere in Josephus. And we're going to look at two other episodes in Josephus. And what I'd like to suggest in light of these other episodes is that what we're seeing in our story is not a conventional or generic plot. We're seeing something that is very distinctly Herodian. Okay? So let us begin with the first text. Here we are in Josephus' Antiquities, in Book 15. And so it happened that the day on which the work of the temple was completed, right? Herod famously has the temple rebuilt, right? One of the most massive building projects of his career, right? So on the day on which the work of the temple was completed, that day coincided with that of the king's accession to the throne, which they were accustomed to celebrate. And because of the double occasion, the festival was a very glorious one indeed. What Josephus seems to be saying here, as Van Henten, can just see the bottom, picked up in his commentary on Josephus, right? The festival commemorating the completion of the temple construction was apparently set on Herod's accession day, i.e. probably on the day he was appointed king by the Romans. Let's try to unpack what's going on here. There's a day, the day which celebrates the day Herod acceded to the throne. Herod became king. Now, apparently, the Jews were not sufficiently elated. They weren't sufficiently excited in Herod's mind on that day, which does stand to reason, because Herod, as we noted, was not a very popular king. So he sought to manipulate the people's sentiments by aligning the date of his accession to the throne with that of the completion of the temple. Okay? So he is manipulating the people's mood, the people's emotions and their sentiments by coordinating two events to happen on the same day. Now that's precisely what he does in our story as well, except here the type of sentiment he wants to create is reversed. In our story regarding his death, he's worried that people will be happy, so he wants to make it a sad day, so he'll coordinate a tragedy on that day. In this case, he's afraid people aren't sufficiently happy, they're actually sad, so he wants to make them happy, so he coordinates the completion of the temple to occur on the very day on which he received the throne, and that way people will now celebrate his becoming king. Okay? So that was regarding the king's evil intention, his desire to manipulate the people's sentiments. Well, we find here in another Herodian story, Herod doing something rather similar. He wants to manipulate the people's sentiments, and he does so with the same type of technique of coordinating two events, one happy, one sad, to happen on the same day. Okay? In the case, of course, with Herod, he would think that they're both actually quite happy. He acceded to the throne, and he completed the temple. But of course, from the people's eyes, him becoming king was not a happy event. Okay, now we're going to move on to the second element. We said there were two elements. One was his intentions here, and the second was the king's foiled plot. Right? So Josephus recounts a story in his writings 3 times. Okay, actually twice are. At 2 of these accounts, he's actually telling the same story in 2 different books. And then he has a very similar story, but it is not the same story, which happens again. And what happens in this story? Herod was fearful that he might not survive a summit with a Roman leader. In one account, the Roman leader is Antony, in the other account, it's Augustus. Okay. So in any event, before he sets out to He leaves Judea to meet this Roman official. He entrusted his wife, Miriam, and in one version he also entrusts it's her mother Alexandra, both Miriam and Alexandra. He gives them over to a faithful associate or associates, along with horrific secret instructions. Okay. Let's see a short quote of this. So he left his uncle in charge of the affairs of the realm, secretly giving him instructions that if anything fatal happened to him while he was with Antony, Joseph should at once do away with Miriam too. So this is a story of a very cruel king. Right? Herod plots to have his innocent wife, and in one case also her mother, put to death in case he should die. Okay? So in these different versions, he commands a trustworthy friend or confidant or two to execute his innocent relative or relatives if news of his death should arrive. Now, in one version of the story, Miriam and her mother are held captive in a fortress until Herod's fate is known, and in all three versions, Herod's evil plot is foiled. In all three versions, Herod's confidant reveals the secret evil plan to Miriam. And in one version, he even decides to spare her life when Herod's death is falsely reported in Jerusalem. So there's a false rumor that Herod dies. In theory, the rumor arrives, he hears of Herod's death, he should have killed Miriam, but he does not. Now, in short, this story, this Herodian plot is very similar to the story we have of Herod's death. In both stories, we have Herod secretly instructing seemingly trustworthy confidants to execute innocent people upon hearing of his death. The innocents are imprisoned at first, but in the end, Herod's plot is thwarted when his confidants betray his trust. So the narrative arc of these two Herodian stories, this royal plot to have innocents murdered following the king's demise, and the confidants' unwillingness to carry out the plot, they thwart the king's evil intentions, this emerges as a distinctly Herodian plotline. Okay. So to sum up the argument being made here, we see there are two essential elements of our story. The king's evil intentions to manipulate the people's mood or sentiments by coordinating two events to occur on the same date, right? And then his evil plan to murder innocents on the day of his death, which is ultimately foiled, right, by his confidants. We see these are characteristically Herodian traits. Okay? So this makes the case that we can add now, say, a sixth reason based on these texts, sources which weren't considered before, that really our story, as we initially suspected, is a Herodian story. It is a typically Herodian story. It is not what we'd say a generic or conventional plot. It is a typically Herodian story which subsequently was transferred from Herod to the rabbis. Right? The rabbis move this story of an evil king to who in their mind is the quintessential evil king, even more so than Herod, and that is Yanai. And thus our story moves from Josephus's account, where Josephus preserves the earlier version of the story, which is an originally Herodian account, which eventually over time is moved to Herod. Okay. A recurring message, which I hope you've noticed in this lecture, in the previous lecture, the previous two lectures, is that when exploring the formation of stories in rabbinic literature, we should adopt a very wide lens. And I've tried to illustrate the breadth of this lens in different ways in the different lectures. Okay? In the first story of Alexander the Great in Shimon HaTzadik, we saw how a biblical paradigm, right, the Purim story of Megillat Esther, informed the formation of the rabbinic version of this ancient legend, and how one Second Temple festival, the day of Mount Gerizim, was modeled on the biblical paradigm of a different Second Temple festival, the story of Purim, the festival of Purim. Okay. In our second story, the story about the siege of Jerusalem during the Hasmonean revolt, we initially looked at a parallel in the Yerushalmi, focusing on twin parallel stories, which had quite striking similarities to our story of the revolt. But there was something missing there, and missing from all the other sources that were obviously Josephus and obvious parallels, was the traitorous and conniving traitor who, the old man who gave over Jerusalem, right? Who understood that there was a continuous service in the city which was preserving the city. So we expanded the purview when we looked in the Yerushalmi, and we saw if we look at the whole sugya, well, we find another story about an old conniving individual dealing with another siege who understood that the continuous religious service in the city was preserving the city, and that in order to conquer the city, one had to stop that service, and that's what he did. So we found a source of inspiration for our story there by expanding our purview and looking at a full sugya way beyond the exact parallel. Well, not so far beyond, we're still in the same sugya. And also in terms of time, here, rather than finding a biblical parallel, we found that a story from a later revolt, almost 200 years later, served as a model for the formation of the story about an earlier revolt. So today, we've also expanded the lens, but rather than expanding the lens in rabbinic literature, we looked further in Josephus by taking into account some sources in Josephus which were previously, I think, overlooked in the context of our story. I've tried to show that a story, sometimes thought, say, to be a generic or universal story, was actually a Herodian story, and this clarifies for us how the rabbis took this Herodian story and transferred it to Yanai. By expanding our scope of the analysis of Josephus, we've gained new insight into the rabbinic account of the story. Thank you.